Thank you so much for coming. My name's Emma. I'm with Book Soup, and we're delighted to be hosting Michael Wohl in conversation with Ethan Sandler, discussing Michael's new book, In Herschel's Wake. You may know Michael Wohl, who's joined tonight by fellow writer, film producer, and actor Ethan Sandler, as one of the original designers of Apple's iconic film editing program, Final Cut Pro. He's also an award-winning filmmaker himself and has maintained parallel careers as an author, professor, and educator. But tonight we might learn a little bit more about a little more personal side of him as we discuss his new memoir. But let's hear about that from the man himself. So please help me welcome Michael Wohl and Ethan Sandler.
Excellent, thank you. Look at this great crowd. Thank you guys all so much for coming. In Herschel's Wake is a memoir about an experience that I had when my father, who was living on the lam from the law on a remote Caribbean island, died unexpectedly, suddenly. And I and my two siblings had to go to this remote island and deal with this situation. And this little island was very remote, had no services at all. We literally had to do everything by hand, including build a coffin by hand, dig a hole in the ground by hand, clean the body by hand, and all the while dealing with this very complicated relationship with this father and with each other, my siblings and the three of us. My brother I really never met, and my sister and I had a fairly estranged dynamic before this. So this is sort of the story of all those things coming together, and while it's a story about a death and some serious topics, it's really mostly about I think the forgiveness of coming to terms with these relationships and how to make peace with people. And so it's a happy book. And with that, I'm going to read the introduction or the prologue, which is titled 1984. It was unsettling to see my father in a suit. His beard was unusually kempt and trimmed, his bouncy Jew-fro surprisingly tame and adorned with a white silk yarmulke, bobby-pinned a little off-center. He was wearing a loud, wide 1970s necktie, no longer remotely in style now that it was 1984. He opened his face into a big, dopey grin, his yellow smoker's teeth glowing in the dim light of the synagogue antechamber where I stood waiting by myself. "Hey, kiddo." "Look at you," I whispered, "all dressed up." My freshly tightened braces caused my words to slur a bit. He nodded and gave an amused shrug as he looked around. "I feel like I'm in the other team's locker room," he said. He wiggled his shoulders in an exaggerated shudder. We could hear the rabbi talking to the congregation on the other side of the curtain beside us. "You still have time to change your mind, you know. Jilt God at the altar and keep your integrity." "You had a bar mitzvah," I said. "You survived." He rocked his head back and forth. "Perhaps." "I am kind of nervous," I confessed. "I'll be glad when the reading is over." He put his hand on my shoulder. "Relax. Have fun. Remember, religion is nothing but a human construct. Plus, from here on in, you get to make your own rules." I smiled back at him, not really understanding. He continued, "That's at least a little consolation for, being a man now." He winked, and then, looking around to ensure that we were alone, he slipped a small, fat envelope into my hand. "And of course, this'll help too." I looked down and spread the top of the envelope open with my thumb and finger. Inside were 3 chubby marijuana joints. They smelled glorious. "Happy birthday, buddy." I grinned, covering for the guilt of holding the contraband right there in the synagogue. He turned to leave. "Don't, just keep it from your sister." "Of course," I said, trying to play it cool, tickled to share a secret with him, already trying on the posture of what I thought adulthood required. He nodded and headed back out, disappearing just as the cantor appeared, waving me to step on stage. "Come on, it's time." I stuffed the envelope into my inside suit pocket, took a breath, and tried to steady myself, but the grin kept fighting its way back to my face. The cantor led me through the curtain, and I stepped up to the bima, where an ornate Torah was splayed out. We had rehearsed all this, but still, I started to sweat. I thrust my hand into my pocket and made a fist. The rabbi laid his heavy hand on my shoulder. Bar mitzvah is both blessing and obligation. I was overjoyed when young Michael here came to us, determined to find his own way, to mark his passage into adulthood with me and with all of you. I looked out at the audience, all my friends sitting politely and patiently, at my 18-year-old sister Anais with her over-earnest, over-encouraging smile, and at my mom beside her in the front row, gritting her teeth with anxiety on my behalf, and probably focused most on how her rich, successful brother and his perfect family were judging our Ungepachka attempt to pretend we were normal. My mom was ambivalent about her Judaism. As a toddler, during the Holocaust, safely growing up in Queens, she remained blissfully unaware of the horrors being committed, least of all her own family's connection to it. Her parents never spoke of their religion, until at 13 she came upon her father crying after a meeting with a doctor who knew people from the old country. Only then was she forced to absorb the reality of why she had no relatives on her father's side. For me, Judaism was a part of my identity that I understood to be a little bit unfortunate, like a cleft palate or being short, something that made me different, but that I could compensate for with wit or mathematical acumen. I didn't know anything about bar mitzvahs until my friends started having these elaborate parties and getting showered with gifts and savings bonds. Best of all, a bar mitzvah was an excuse to invite all the girls from school to a party where I'd be the center of attention. I wanted in. Dad slipped into the sanctuary through a side door and managed to trip over and knock down a stack of collapsed folding chairs lined up along the side aisle, creating a cascading eruption of noise and garnering the attention of everybody in the room. He flashed a quick smile and a quick wave to the congregation, and making no effort to clean up the mess, he scanned the seats for a place to sit. The rabbi continued, trying to overcome the distraction. And so, it's quite fortuitous that today's passage is one about self-determination above all things, and about duty to oneself, to one's family, and to God. He nodded grandly at me, a cue for me to begin, but I just stood there frozen. He moved his hand from my shoulder to the small of my back and forcibly pulled me forward a step. "Begin whenever you're ready," he grunted. I watched my dad make his way to his seat in the third row, forcing a few of my classmates to get up to let him pass. He was smugly oblivious to my struggle to muster the courage to speak, to proceed with this thing, this commitment I had made, perhaps despite him, though my teenage emotions were hardly coherent enough for me to consciously recognize that. And he finally sat down, of all places, right next to my Goy crush, Mary Ann O'Malley. I cleared my throat and began my memorized Hebrew. The rabbi stuffed the yod into my hand, and then with his hand on top of mine, roughly dragged the pointer along the hand-drawn glyphs on the scroll. As I spoke, he unconsciously mouthed the reading along with me, occasionally vocalizing that plosive sound so common in Hebrew. When I next looked up, my eyes went straight to that third pew 4 seats in, and I watched as my dad leaned over and whispered something in Mary Ann's ear, making her blush. She covered her face with her hand as she tried to stifle a laugh. I darted my eyes back down to the scroll and closed them as I struggled through the last few stanzas. God, please make him die, I thought.
Thank you for that. Hello, everybody. I'm Ethan. I've had the good pleasure of meeting Michael through this book. And it's just a beautiful, taut, vulnerable, expansive retelling of something that could have been so embittering, but you found a way to make something truly beautiful out of this experience.
Thank you.
I was surprised I enjoyed it so much because it's so foreign to me, just dad issues and marijuana and Judaism and So it was a shock that I found a way into this story. I have some questions. I thought we could just chat about this book together.
Please, yes, indeed.
You know, the drumbeat of it, to me as I read it, really involves the terrible, inevitable transformation of ourselves into our parents. And I wanted to share with you, I actually have a tattoo of a seahorse on my back. Have I told you this before? Oh, I'm sorry. That I got.
You've now shared it with everybody
I have
here.
a tattoo of a seahorse on my back, which I got very.
After reading my book.
Yes. Will you sign my back? I learned at 16 that the male seahorses take care of the babies, and at that point I was like, that's me! And got a tattoo as early as possible, which I only share with you because that's just I'll show you dad move. To launch myself into a manhood that was so unlike his, and now at our stage in life, 29 years old, I could not strike more the same silhouette as my father. His voice just erupts from my mouth often. And you have a beautiful way of weaving together all the ways that's true for you. As a writer, the trappings of writing, the desk, the idiosyncrasies like the same vape pen, but also you keep making these beautiful references every time someone says, holy shit, you're the spitting image of your father. When you combine that with, and I'm sorry to paraphrase your book to you, I think that's in bad form in a situation like this, but you quote him as saying to you, you come from a long line of father haters. I hated my father, he hated his, and you'll hate yours. So I wanted to ask you first if you could speak to, in this experience of saying goodbye, and maybe in the experience of articulating that experience, how you sit now in the process of, for lack of a better word, becoming your father.
Yeah, I think that I spent most of my life fighting against being connected to him. I mean, well, there was a period when I was young when I idolized him, but very quickly as I grew up, I discovered his irresponsibility and the ways that he was interacting with the world in pretty negative ways. And I was like, I don't want to be anything like that. And yet, you know, as you're saying, like there was this inevitable becoming him. And I think that, and so one of the stories that I tell about when we went to this remote island, everybody we met, it's a very small island, everybody knew everyone, and everyone looked at me and was like, oh my goodness, you're Dr. Joe's son, you're him, he's here, he's back with us. And I was just like, no, I'm not, I'm different, I'm me. And like, and over the course of the story, part of one of the things that I try to find is the acceptance of that. I can't run from that, I can't deny that. And I think that it took a long time, but I think that when you are fighting against your parents, you're becoming your parent, it is a fairly futile and self-destructive effort because you are trying to attack something. It's like you're trying to destroy something that is in you. I mean, literally in every single cell of your body is the DNA of your parents, right? And not only your parents, but of course your ancestors. Like the historic of how we come to be is we are of the people and of the world that we come from. And I mean, it's a natural progress for everyone, I think, to fight against that and find your own individuality. But in my case, it was particularly challenging because he was such a troublemaker in a lot of ways and was very unkind in a lot of ways. And so I was really fighting this, I'm not like him, I'm not like that. And then little by little sort of recognizing that if I try to keep him at arm's length, if I try to deny that connection, I'm really punishing myself. And it took a long time. And you said, like in the reflecting and the writing, I mean, honestly, it took a decade of this story happened in 2008. So now it's been 15 years since this happened. And my life has changed dramatically since then, and not in small part because of the experiences of this story and coming to terms with that relationship. You know, I think that the point is that if you don't find forgiveness, you wind up punishing yourself. I think that's the simplest.
Okay, I don't need the accusation. I get it. I'm trying. I want to put a pin in forgiveness if that's okay, but
Yes.
I wanted to hear you answer that question. There's also a couple of times in this book where you are very generous in showing your less flattering sides and your less flattering thoughts, and not just about your dad, but about the situation you were in, about the people you were with, and that's just super attractive as a storyteller. You know, I felt relief that you weren't trying to present a version of yourself that you were willing to have an honest examination of what you went through. So related to that, this is not your first book, but it is your first memoir. And I was excited to learn about you, that you come from a place, or not come from, but spend so much time in editing and in editing software. And so it was interesting to read it and think of you thinking of how events line up next to each other and rhythm, etc. And so part of that got me thinking about, and I know we've chatted about this a little bit before, but the relationship between a memory and an anecdote and a story, and how you went through, just as you mentioned, you went through some serious shit. Building a coffin for your father is no joke. And
there's a joke in there about that.
it's not funnily written, it's very funny. But, I know the experience of going through something really profound and then trying to make art out of it, and watching how that event has to change in the telling of it. And lastly, you're telling a story about a man who spent his life trying to tell a story about his life. A book that he called The Kind of Life That Was Being Lived. That title is basically, I'm alive right now, I'm writing it, you know? And so I'm just curious what your thinking is now about the relationship between those intense events we have in these experiences we have in our life, and then the process to telling it as a story, and for you, chasing this kind of story that he was in the journey of telling.
You know, I spent a lot of my life teaching people how to write and how to edit and how to tell stories. And I really thought I had it, you know, I could tell it. I had a good pitch for what it was. What is story? How does it work? You know, what are the mechanics of story, and how, if you assemble things in the right way, people will respond. I think story is important. Absolutely, I think story, the way we communicate important ideas in the world is through story. And through story, we can teach people things that you can't learn any other way. And that is magic, right? And that's what's kept me, why I have dedicated my life to things around story for so long. But like, the magic of story is that you can enable someone to go through an experience without suffering the pain that you went through necessarily, or they can learn that the stove is hot without having to touch it. If you just tell somebody don't touch the stove, of course they're going to touch the stove. But if you embody them in a story, if you put them in a narrative where they are going through the full-on emotional experience, their brain is tricked into that experience, and they therefore understand why they shouldn't do this thing. And you know, the stove is a little bit of obviously a simplistic example, but like teaching about bravery or love or forgiveness is not something that you can just tell somebody. You have to forgive somebody, or you're going to suffer your whole fucking life. Excuse me to the minors in the audience. And the magic of story is something that I thought could be constructed and told and taught. And I'm increasingly thinking that it's a little bit more about getting out of the way, and you know, a writer, a storyteller needs to be a bit of a conduit, more than controlling. Let the story be and let it come out. If you tell a story without the emotion, you have an anecdote. Right, so something happens, and you tell the story about what happens. You tell the story over and over again, and you find the humor in it. You find the surprise in it, and you create an anecdote, a story, something that happened. And we all tell anecdotes, and anecdotes have value because they're fun and they connect people, and they allow you to talk about something that might be a serious event, but in a gentle way. And the example that I gave last time we talked about this is that the night we moved into our house last summer, our 4-year-old son, 3-year-old son at the time, got COVID and had a seizure the night we moved into our house. And it was this like crazy experience where like we're in this house, we don't know where anything is, we don't know what to do, we can't we don't know how we need to take him to the hospital according to our doctor, and our daughter is sleeping, and what are we going to do? And so, you know, Sarah calls her sister, who comes racing over and it's a strangely quick amount of time, and like she gets there in like 7 minutes from like what should be a 30-minute drive, and then we rush to the hospital and we go in and they're like, yeah, he's totally fine. And in the emergency room, there's this guy who's like there, he's from the drunk tank, and he's like bouncing around on one leg and he's hitting on the nurse, and anyway, and then we get home, and our daughter never woke up, and Nora got to go home. She never even went inside the house because, of course, we all had COVID. So she stayed outside the house the whole time. This is like for 3 hours in the middle of the night, on and on. So this is the story that I've told now many, many times, and I'm not sharing the terror that we felt, the actual anguish of our 3-year-old is having a seizure. We're going to the emergency room. We don't know what's going on. We're unsettled. All of that is sort of stripped out of the anecdote version of that story. Story needs the real emotion, and it needs to be moderated in a way so that the reader can read it without being overwhelmed. And finding that balance requires skill and requires some magic, some patience, some tolerance, some ability to let it be and let it manage itself, let the story come out on its own.
Well, thank you for that. And I think in this case, that magic comes in your love of your dad. And I think clearly you're exploring closure, you're exploring forgiveness. There's this extraordinary moment you describe where you essentially have a slight panic attack in his deathbed, that you wake up and you're in this place, you have no idea where you are, and it's like slowly comes to you like, oh, I'm in the bed where my father lay dying a few days ago. You describe the pain, you describe the blood, you describe the vomit. The book Kim on the nightstand, which is like, among a million things, also a book about an orphan, and that incredible moment where you really took in his humanity, his animalness, and then I'm going to try to find this quickly. For me, that connects to this incredible moment where you describe real compassion for your father, a moment that, looking back, compassion sort of like whispered to you, a moment where you were snorkeling with him and you saw a seahorse, per earlier tidbits. Thank you. And he explained what it was, and that was an incredible moment. And then you looked back in the water, there was a barracuda. It scared the shit out of you. Pardon me. And then the barracuda left, and you wanted to share that terror with your father. And you say, a few minutes later, I finally located Dad, snorkeling on his own 30 feet away. I swam over to him, buoyant with adrenaline and newfound invincibility, but he was oblivious. Back on the beach, I tried to relay my story, but he was preoccupied, so I stopped. I remember a look on his face. It was the same look I saw when we were in Paris. It was a look that he wore often when I was young, and I never understood it at the time, but I knew enough that it meant to leave him alone. Now, in my memory, I recognize it. It was terror. As frightened as I may have been at the barracuda, he was enduring something much more existential. I'll never know what, but I'm beginning to understand that he carried it with him always. I just found that so beautiful, and as a parent, I found that beautiful. As a child, obviously, I found that you remember a time seeing him as his own human being, and now you're able to look back in time and see that compassion anew. This was a long road to forgiveness for you, and it's generous of you to share it with us. And, you described being on the plane, finally reading his book, finally seeing him for who he was, and I'm curious, has the writing of the book brought you to closure? Has the speaking of the book brought you to closure? Is closure something that still feels like a shadow ahead of you?
I think that the writing of the book has been a tremendous source of closure, of making sense of that relationship, of forgiving him for some pretty terrible things that went on, many of which are in the book, some of which didn't even make it in. I held a lot of anger towards him throughout my life, and it was really not until I was able to write the book and get that out that I have been able to feel more myself. I think there is a way in which forgiveness enables recovery, but you have to be recovered a certain amount to be able to forgive. It's a catch-22. They sort of work in this, it's a circular effort. You have to be able to be comfortable with yourself in order to be. You have to be a big enough person to forgive somebody for doing some pretty shitty things. Sorry, Rosie. But if you don't, you just continue to suffer.
Yeah.
And so the timing of me writing this book and going through this experience, because first the experience of burying him was a stage of forgiveness, and that really enabled me to sort of, I'm no longer fighting with him in real life. He's gone now, and I think that was the seed of what enabled me to finally move on with my life and meet somebody who became my wife, who enabled me that enabled me to envision a world where I could be hopeful and have a vision of the future that was positive. And then my wife got pregnant, and in the 3 or 4 months before our first baby came is when I wrote this book in a fury and a passion, like it had to come out before the baby because I didn't know what was going to happen then. And I wrote that draft, and that was another stage of like, okay, I've got this story out, I've put it out, and then I sort of put it down, and other things happened, and then came back to it several years later again, and that section you just read where I really nail the forgiveness, where I'm finally like, he was his own person, he was suffering, and that is, it doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it explains it a little bit. And that enabled me to release the last or the next layer of the onion. I mean, I'm sure it goes on forever, but like it enabled me to have a whole nother level of forgiveness. And I think that it has been incredibly useful for me personally, but I also think that the story, sharing the story, making it public in this way is for me an effort to use that experience to help others find, to give an example of how that forgiveness can be so enlivening and helpful. And it's a self-help book, really. See, if you just read it, it's step-by-step instructions on how to forgive your asshole father.
Quick subtitle.
Thank you for that. And it's, I will say, as your audience, it certainly, it's like a beautiful campfire story in that way. It's sort of like, God, that's a great way for that process to go. So thank you for sharing it, and congratulations.
Thank you.
There's no pressure, but we thought we could open it up to sort of the larger crowd if anyone has questions they'd like to ask this esteemed author. Yes.
So, Michael, I've known you for some years, and I'm just curious about when someone I know who's not a known author writes a book, I get this fear, and I'm like, oh God, is this going to be my friend trying to imitate Hemingway or something? And Ethan, you mentioned feeling relieved that he was so open and honest in the book. I too was relieved, because not only was that the case, but I felt like the voice of the story is very natural, very you, but still eloquent and interesting. And I'm just wondering, do you have a model when you're writing? Are you thinking like, I'm going to be, what's your model for your voice, basically? Or is it just something you've honed and naturally born gifted writer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a simple answer. First of all, I want to just thank you for that appreciation. I really do appreciate the way you describe that. And I think the truth is, like, I'm so insecure at a certain level that I'm just I want to make sure that it's funny and likable and easy to understand, but there's enough of like I understand what's important. I understand I need to be honest. I need to share some of the things that are ugly or unpleasant to hear, but like I am very conscious of making sure that it is a balance of entertaining, and not like silly entertaining, but like engaging, and like there's not a writer that there's many writers that I admire tremendously, but there's not a writer that I think I'm emulating in any way. I learned writing in a lot of ways through screenwriting, and so arc of story and the structure of story from a screenplay is always in my head when I'm writing and thinking about like where does this fit in the arc, where does this element fit in a story, because I understand again this mechanics of story idea that there are things that make a story work, and if you miss them, if you leave that piece out, then the audience is left feeling a little uncertain. And so I have a little bit of this editor in my head paying attention while I'm doing it, but largely it's just about trying to get the story out and quickly enough and entertainingly enough so that you'll get through it.
Stick to the basics.
There's a quote that an artist's responsibility is to hold your attention as long as they've asked for it. If I stumble onto truth, I get lucky. And it's actually a quote from West Wing. I don't know if John remembers it, but it's a West Wing quote when Tabitha Forsyth, the whatever, that's a character's name, not even a person. Anyway, but it's a beautiful sentiment that like an artist's job is not to tell you the truth. An artist's job is to hold your attention and entertain you, and if they share some truth, that's a bonus, and that's sort of all I strive for. There's a nice long-winded answer.
That's fine, that's great. And I have a real quick question.
Please, nobody else has their hand up, so.
Misremembering this, but did you once tell me that your dad came up with the formula for Zot's candy?
I think, yes, because I mean, I haven't thought of that in so long, and I'm sure I told you that 30 years ago when it was fresher in my memory. Yes, I think my dad was a pharmacologist, and he worked in Shearing Plow and some other big drug companies. One great story is that he was responsible for putting doses of LSD in rabbits. Like he would an eyedropper in the rabbit's eyes. At the time, he was completely straight and would never think of doing drugs. Like 2 years later, he was tripping every day. But anyway, so yes, my memory, and you know, he was a storyteller himself, and so the factuality I don't know, but he allegedly came up with the formula for what that tingle in your mouth Zot's candy, but he didn't get credit for it. But like so, but yes, he invented. Let's go with it. He invented Zot's candy. Yes.
There's a question towards the back there.
Please.
I have 3 questions. Do you maintain a relationship with Toby? Did you finish your father's book, and is it any good? And the chapter titles that are book titles, did you write the chapter and then pick the book, or did you use the book title as sort of a guide to write the chapter?
Those are awesome questions. I'm going to go in reverse order. So each chapter in the book, I named the chapter after a famous book. None of them come to mind under the pressure of.
Also, I totally missed that. So,
Really?
yep,
Every chapter title: Desolation Angels, which is Jack Kerouac; The Secret Garden, which is I don't remember the name of the author. Anyway. There's Marquis de Sade, there's John Updike. Mostly the chapter titles are books that my father was very literary. It was very important to him to share literature and books, and most of the titles are books that he introduced me to. I tricked, the answer is I did not. I wrote them later. The titles came later, and I tried to find titles that would work with the chapter, that there's something about the title, either the book that it referenced or just the words of the title referenced, gave you context for the chapter. But generally that's where those titles came from. They're books that he turned me on to, or, and I guess in some cases they're books that I just love, and in some they're just random books that I found a good title that I thought worked for the chapter, but that's the minority. Okay. Toby, my brother, whose real name is Andrew Tobias. Toby's his middle name. I changed the names of most of the people in the book. But yes, we are still very close, although he lives in Westchester and has 2 very young kids, and I live in Los Angeles and have 2 pretty young kids, and so we don't see nearly enough of each other as I wish we did. But I have tremendous love for him and his family and try to stay in touch with them, and and we vowed, and it's in the book, that we vowed to stay in touch after this experience. So the story, for the people who haven't read the book yet, I had this half-brother, my father's son, who was 15 years younger than me, and basically, when he was 3 or 4, his mother took him away, divorced my dad, and I never saw him at all until my dad's funeral 25 years later. and then we were thrust together, and like we are brothers, but we don't know each other at all. And anyway, and I was really it was a very big experience for me to reconnect with him. We're not as close as I wish we were. I wish I could see him on a regular basis, but the love, I think, the bonds that we made there did really hold. Okay, and the middle question was, how have I finished my book? Yeah, so the book my dad wrote, and he spent his entire life writing this book, from like the day he dropped out at like 36 till he died at 70. He was working on this novel that was that by the time he died was 6 books, 6 500-page books, a triptych. Each triptych was 2 volumes. Like, it's absurdly big and very unwieldy. The writing is at times good, at times brilliant, mostly sort of convoluted, and he was he talked about emulating. He wanted to be Joyce. He wanted to be Thomas Pynchon. He wanted to be, he thought that the more complicated it was, the harder it was to read, the more you suffered while reading it, the better a book it was, which is sort of the opposite of my approach, which is like fill it with candy so that you'll get it down. I have not read all 6 volumes. The first 2 volumes, and it's his life, it's all autobiographical, although it's in a novel form. The first 2 volumes I've read. The second 2 volumes I got through mostly. I think I probably trailed off somewhere in the book 4. I think I fell off, and I have picked up the last ones and looked at them, but not really read them. So, and I feel some guilt about that, but I also feel like instead I'm trying to preserve his legacy through my own writing instead.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Yes.
Talking about the candy, one of the most delightful parts of the book is the pacing and how quick and what a quick read it is. And part of it has to do intrinsically with the structure and going back from those memories to the real event that's taking place in the book. And my question is, when you were writing it, did the memories fall out sequentially, or did you focus on the event first, or was focusing on the events on that remote island a way back into memory?
All of the above. I wish I could take credit for the pacing, but in a large part, my editor did a tremendous job figuring that out. The way it was structured when I sent it in, sent it into the editor, was basically like the first third of the book was 70% memory, 30% present day, and the present day meaning the story of the island. And the last 2/3 of the book were the opposite. So there were still a few flashbacks, but the bulk of the memories, the backstory. And so the book really tells this linear story of going to the island and dealing with the funeral and then coming back. But interspersed between that is all these memories of growing up with my father, things that influenced, things that affected my decisions about how I got here and why we're doing these things that we are on the island. So I had written it really with a lot of the memories up front, and my editor I was like, I just don't know how to integrate. I know they should be integrated, but I was like, I don't know. And the editor was like, this one goes here, this one goes here, this one goes here, and this one we split in half and put this one here and here. And I was like, really? And it was brilliant. Like, and she really was able to see it in a way that I wasn't. That said, when I wrote it the first time, I was aware, and I wanted to integrate those stories, and I wanted, like the bar mitzvah scene being the opening. It was like I knew that was the opening from the second I envisioned writing the book. Like, I was like, it has to start with the bar mitzvah. That sets up everything, the dynamic with this person. And so I wanted it to feel that way of bouncing back and forth. But I give a lot of credit to the editor too.
I have a quick question about memory as it relates to the way you structured the book and approached it. So much of my past I've worked to forget in order to be able to get past and move on. And so did you find, are you always facile with memory, or is it something that came back as part of your process?
Really the latter. Like, in fact, I feel like I have a terrible memory, and I've long thought of it. It's not just age. Like, I've always felt like I'm really bad at remembering details, and I have. And so wonderfully, beautifully, there are a number of people in the room tonight who I've known for a very, very long time, like Liz and Greg and Daniel. I mean, these people that I've known for 40 years. Liz and I went to high school together, and like, I feel like I talk to these friends and I'm like, I don't remember that at all. And they're like telling me stories that happened. And except that when I started writing the book, I would open the story and it would be like opening this crevice in my mind, and it would all be there. Details, tiny details, textures, visual details of, I mean, you know, and sure, I'm fabricating some of it. I know that I'm fabricating some of it, but there's a tremendous amount of organic, like, no, that's exactly what happened. That the pressure that when the rabbi pushes me forward a little bit by grabbing me by the small, like, I felt it when I, you know, it was so present. And it was like when I was able to, once I like, you know, I had this vague memory of a story. Oh, we went snorkeling, and what was that about? And then I start writing it, and all of a sudden I can see the seahorse, and I can see the rock next to the seahorse that my dad thought I was pointing to. That I was like, there's a seahorse, and he was like, oh, that's a rock. Yes, it's a beautiful piece. And I was like, no, it's a fucking seahorse. You know, and I'd never seen one before. Anyway, like, so it really came back incredibly with this tremendous precision, which gives me hope that the memories are not gone. They just need to be jostled, certainly, to make them come out. And yet, like, I also, memory is fallible, right? We all know that memory is incredibly subjective, and I may be wrong. Like, there may be those memories, I maybe have fabricated them in the experience of writing them. You know, in the author's note, I talk about this. I say this book is true mostly because I feel like, and this is something that my dad taught me that I think is true. Fiction is more truthful often than narrative fact. Like, the details of the actual events are not necessarily as meaningful or as important as is the emotional truth of it, the experience of it. And so I tried to prioritize that emotional truth, that emotional through line, more so than the verisimilitude of the details. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you think your dad would say about the book?
Channel your dad.
How would he review it for you?
So I think, and Ethan actually asked me that in our last discussion, but I say in the dedication, I say I dedicate it to Sarah and my children and my siblings, and I also said, and my father, who probably would have hated it. I think that.
But do you think that's true?
Well, I think that he would have. He was always very supportive of my writing. And I think he also was placating me a lot as I was, you know, I mean, I shared everything I ever wrote with him throughout my whole life while he was alive. And I would share everything from my high school papers to my screenplays. And he was always like, oh yeah, good job, you know. And so I didn't get a lot of genuine criticism from him. But knowing how seriously he took the way he wrote and the way he treated writing, I think he would say it's too...
enjoyable.
Yes, it's not challenging enough. If it doesn't hurt, it's not real. He'd be like, yeah, you didn't go deep enough. You didn't. I'm like, I couldn't go any deeper. My God, I like put my blood on the page, you know. But like, I think he would say, and I think maybe writing it, I'm aware of that like voice at some level. That like that's part of what kept me honest, perhaps, was that like I have to expose the feeling that was true.
I mean, that's the first time I've heard you essentially suggest that you had him over your shoulder as you were writing, and that he was pushing you to places that maybe you weren't all, you know, initially comfortable to go. And I think that's gorgeous, and it's part of what makes it such a beautiful book to read.
Thank you.
If you haven't purchased it, they're here. I know for a fact I've seen them walk in the door. I cannot recommend this book or this gentleman highly enough. Nice to be here. Nice to meet you all.